Hello there, Chris Kallal here, technical agronomist for DEKALB Asgrow in West Central Illinois. In this video, we're going to look at our 108-day to 112-day SmartStax hybrids and talk a little bit about their performance in 2020 and positioning as we go into 2021. 5 different products that we offer in this maturity: a brand new 5864 SmartStax, 5981, 6087, 6140, and 6252. I'll talk about each one of them, but a couple of them in greater detail than others. In this graph, we're looking at the yield advantage of each individual hybrid versus competitive rootworm protected hybrids. This is a 3-year summary of greater West Central Illinois geography. The yield numbers are there along the left-hand side of the graph. The win rate, which is depicted by the orange line, is on the right side of the graph. Specifically looking at 5864 and its performance in 2020, its introductory year, this hybrid got off to a pretty good start. You can see that by this chart, it does get better as the yield environment climbs, and that's exactly what we saw out of it. I would say there's a little bit of a trend in the data that this hybrid does get better at kind of maybe an I-74 or north latitude, especially maybe kind of from Bloomington over towards Peoria and north. It becomes a little bit more common as you move south of there. 5981 repeating its solid performance again here in 2020, just like what we saw out of it in 2019. Broadly adapted with a slight bias to get a little bit better as the yield environment climbs. But really, this has been a great product for us in a sub 110 that can handle a little bit of stress, take a lot of broad acres, handle some wet feet. We can put this thing about anywhere, and it's going to perform pretty well. Here's a peek at how 6140 did in 2020. So this would suggest that it definitely does get stronger as the yield environment climbs. I would say as we look at the multi-year data, it's got a little bit more guts to it than what this graph would depict. So I think it does have a little bit more broad acre adaptability than what this graph is giving it credit for as we look at that multi-year data. Here we're graphing each individual product's performance relative to that of 6140. You can see that 6252 falls to the bottom of the chart. I believe a lot of that has to come from the fact that 6140 works a lot better in some of the prairie soils, handles a little bit more saturated soils than what 6252 does, and 6140 performs at a little higher yield level than what 6252 does. Jumping over to 6087. 6087 isn't all that terribly far behind 6140, but again, I think we see a little bit more broad acre adaptability out of 6140 than what we do with 6087. 5981 and 6140's performance is almost identical to each other across most yield levels. We'll talk about that in a second. And then 5864 came in, again, with a pretty impressive showing in year one, especially at those higher yield levels. I elected not to show the stability graphs of either 6087 or 6252. I think we're fairly well familiar with how those products perform. 6087 is really, in my opinion, a tried and true product. It's had solid performance ever since we launched it in 2016. We've used it on a lot of situations. It's had excellent emergence. We've used it for early planting. It seems to tolerate wet feet pretty well, so we've used it in a lot of poorly drained acres. It's just been a good performing product for us year in and year out. The 2 chinks in the armor I'll call out on 6087 is, one, it is fairly susceptible to gray leaf. So if we have a major outbreak and a guy refuses to spray a fungicide, that can get us in trouble. The other one is that its roots are a little bit shaky, and sometimes we've seen it root tip on some of these really dark soils that they lose their structure when they're saturated. 6252 is a hybrid that we've had a fair amount of success with in the previous years. Just to be honest, it is decreasing in its utility in the lineup as a SmartStax. We're leaning very heavily on the Double Pro version of this hybrid in West Central Illinois, on a lot more of those rolling, more transitional acres where it really seems to perform quite well. But the SmartStax, we've come to know that it does not tolerate poorly drained fields very well. And as we come more to the prairie soils, oftentimes we find ourselves in a little bit more saturated soil condition. So 6252 just hasn't hung in there quite as well on some of the prairie soils. And with the amount of SmartStax we're selling every year kind of becoming less and less, we are culling some products out of the lineup, and 6252 is one of those that has definitely fallen victim of that. We've likely got far better options in this maturity that can provide better stability but higher end yield potential like customers would expect.